What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and our first episode of the series I'm calling The History of Speed, where we look at enriching and exciting history that has shaped some of the best sports cars of the world that we know and love today. So for this first episode, I'm super excited. We are looking at the birth of an icon, the beginnings of how the Chevy Corvette came to be as the Generation 1 C1 Corvette. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a bold American statement. But that almost didn't happen right from the get-go. The start of the Corvette was riddled with issues from an underpowered motor, an automatic transmission when the car was screaming for a manual, to even water leaking in the cars when it rained. Thankfully, those things got figured out and led to the birth of the signature American full-send sports car that we know and love today. And did you know that even other cars like the Shelby AC Cobra owe their existence to the Generation 1 Corvette? And it's all because you had some legendary car nuts like the one and only Carroll Shelby who thought to themselves, what would a Corvette mashed together with an Italian sports car look like? And that gave birth to a super rare set of Corvettes called the Scaglietti Trio and laid the foundation for what came to be the Shelby Cobra. I didn't even know about that until I researched all about the C1 Corvette. So let's talk all about that history in today's video. Alrighty, so to start all of this, we need to go way back to the late 1940s. It's just after World War II and our American boys have just finished kicking Hitler's and the Nazis' asses and are coming home from Europe. During their time over there though, those soldiers were falling in love with small and nimble European sports cars from makers like Jaguar, MGs, and Alfa Romeos. The US had nothing of the sort in the market to compete with, and in fact it wasn't until 1951 that Nash Motors, a US car manufacturer, was the first to begin selling a similar small nimble car that was called the Nash Healey. And it was made in partnership with Italian and British car designers and engineers, but it was expensive to sell at nearly $6,000 back in the day, which if you translated that into today's money is like 73,000 grand. So enter Harley Earl, who was the head of GM's styling section, who saw this and was like, yeah, no, we could do better than that. Where two-seat sports cars looked to be a bit pricey for the average Joe, Earl said to himself, hold my beer, and he convinced GM that they could build a sports car on the same level or even better than both the Healey and European counterparts at a fraction of the price. And with GM's graces in 1951, the development of the Generation 1 Corvette was born through a secret project that was codenamed Project Opal. The design and engineering team headed by Earl created a unique exterior design but used off-shelf mechanical components to keep the cost down. The result though was the hand-built EX122 pre-production Corvette. And it's also interesting to note that from the project, there were actually three different body variants that were made. The first was the Roadster, which was built as the Corvette, while the second was a two-door station wagon version, which actually was also eventually built as the Chevy Nomad. And then there was a third version that was a fastback that was named the Corvair. And honestly, that rear end of that Corvette was really nice looking. I honestly would have been all over that if I was living back then. Honestly, it's a shame that it didn't get built. Anyways, so the Roadster version was built as the Corvette and it was designated as EX122 for experimental. And it's considered the oldest known Corvette in existence and is actually still around today, kept preserved at the Quebec Corvette Museum of Atlantic City. Okay, so this EX122 was first shown to the public at the 1953 General Motors Motorama at Waldorf Astoria in New York City on January 17th, and it got a lot of attention. The feedback was so good that GM felt very good at starting the production only 6 months later. The big thing was the outer body, which was made out of fiberglass, which was revolutionary at that time, when most things were made especially out of steel. They could make clean and aerodynamic shapes that were strong and lightweight. And I mean, I know in today's standards, fiberglass is not anything special, especially when you have things like carbon fiber that's strong and lightweight. But back in the 1950s, it was a huge deal from an engineering and production point of view. Steel back then was not only heavy, but there was a major shortage of steel like pretty much everywhere. And before fiberglass, there really wasn't any materials out there that could be strong enough to handle certain types of structural needs and still be relatively light. So this was a game changer for GM using this kind of material in sports cars, which at that point was more common to see in like some boats and even aircraft. So this was a big technical flex from GM debuting this in the EX122. And while production version scheduled to begin 6 months later, it was set at an MSRP of just over $3,500, which was a bit higher than GM was shooting for a price point. It was still significantly cheaper compared to most other two-seaters out there on the market. The only drawback was that Chevy decided to use their good old 235 cubic inch inline-six engine that was rated at a measly 150 horsepower, but they used that pretty much in every single Chevy vehicle at the time. And to make matters worse, it featured a 2-speed Power Glide automatic transmission. So it wasn't perfect to start with, but it was a start. Now, going from this initial experiment Corvette, the Gen 1 C1 Corvette went into production starting that same year in 1953 and went on for 9 years, producing all the way to 1962. So that first production year in 1953, GM produced a simple 300 hand-built unit in a makeshift assembly line that was installed in an old truck plant in Flint, Michigan. It wasn't until the following year that GM did essentially its first full production run in St. Louis, where they pumped out actually 3,600 Corvettes, but those first 300 obviously among the rarest Corvettes out there. And they all had red interiors, polo white exteriors, and blue painted engines. I wonder what that reminds you of. And there weren't really many options to choose from either. The order guide showed heaters and AM radios as options, but in reality, all 300 Corvettes had both equipped. And out of those 300 Corvettes, about 200 or so are still known to exist. And just like any first production run, they had quality control issues with the fiberglass body fit and finishes lacking, and other problems like water leaking through the top and the doors when it rained. Now, this almost nearly sank the car before it really could get off the floor, but thankfully GM pushed forward past that initial first run into 1954 with a new set of colors being available with pennant blue, sportsman red, and black to go along with the polo white. All of them had red interiors except for the pennant blue, which had a beige interior and beige canvas top. They still all had the 6-cylinder engine and automatic transmission, which were not what sports cars enthusiasts especially were expecting, so they wanted more. Even so, probably the biggest set of news in that year was an October 1954 issue of Popular Mechanics, which did an extensive survey of the Corvette and owners in particular in America and what they thought of the car. Now, this was probably the first real honest feedback on the Corvette starting out of the gate. So this was really important, not only to show the strengths of the car, but where the improvements were needed. And it actually had a pretty surprising set of discoveries. So for example, the people that took the survey, 36% of those owners actually had previously owned a foreign sports car. And then breaking down that percentage, more than half of them rated the Corvette as better than a previous foreign sports car, where 19% said of them that they were at equal rating to those kind of sports cars, and then 22% said that the Corvette was inferior to those sports cars. So general consensus was that the people were really loving the Corvette despite the issues, which they also pointed out things like the tendency of water leaking extensively into the body during rainstorms. So the big takeaway from this though is that while many were happy with their Corvettes, a lot of them didn't really consider the car a true sports car, at least not yet. And again, these come from the fact that they needed to get that pathetic piece of an inline-six engine and automatic transmission out of there and give the people what they want. Thankfully though, it didn't take long, because the very next year in 1955, GM finally debuted its 265 cubic inch 4.3 liter small block V8 engine producing 195 horsepower as an available option for the Corvette. It still kept the inline-six as a standard, but only for the remainder of the year. But this new engine was a great step in the right direction, and we have to thank two things happening for this new V8 engine to become a reality. The first was from rival Ford actually, with their new Thunderbird that came into the market with a V8 engine that honestly, it made the Corvette look pretty freaking pathetic when it came to engine power. The second, and most importantly, was that a major player was getting into the mix, and it was none other than Zora Arkus-Duntov. That's right, the renowned engineer who was famously nicknamed the father of the Corvette, and he is now in the picture. He's finally in the game, and if you don't know who Zora is, he is one of the iconic engineer legends, if I can talk, that made the Corvette such a successful sports car over the years. In fact, he was the first to consider making the Corvette a mid-engine design like the C1 Corvette is now. But he considered it way before anyone else had even thought of it because of the benefits of having, a mid-engine design. He was a race car driver too, appearing in things like the 24 Hours of Le Mans, 4 separate times, and I could talk about him for hours alone, but we're here to talk about the C1 Corvette. So this is a big player in the mix, and now we have a proper V8 engine platform, and we can thank him for that. But they still kept the Powerglide automatic transmission for the year, but again, thanks to Zora, the new 3-speed manual transmission became available later that year for the V8 models, which was an absolute godsend. So the end of 1955 was a good year and needed upgrades for the Corvette, and the following year saw the Corvette with even more upgrades that really took the C1 to the next level. It featured a whole new body with real glass roll-up windows and a more substantial convertible top. Probably the most iconic visual that people recognize of the Gen 1 Corvette is that gorgeous two-tone siding, which is now part of that new body style. And that 265 cubic engine V8 is got a little bit more power, from 195 horsepower ranging to now 210 to 240 horsepower, depending on the options you choose. And at this point, you had legit options with this new series being introduced in 1956, including a power-assisted convertible top, removable hardtop, power windows, and leading edge at the time Delco car radio. The 1956 also had a high-performance camshaft that you can take the standard 210 horsepower to 240 horsepower, so not too bad in 1956. By the way, it's crazy to think things like power windows were not a standard option back then, let alone roll-up windows as a standard option that you had to crank up and down to get the windows up and down. The previous years actually had pop-in and out windows for the side if you wanted to get them out. And by the way, believe it or not, I am old enough to remember at least roll-up windows growing up as a kid. And for my viewers that are younger than me and are wondering what the heck am I talking about in regards to roll-up windows, they didn't have a little button back then to push down and up to make your window go up and down. No, you had to take a little crank and literally crank up the window up and down in order to make it go up and down. In any case, I'm getting a little bit off topic. Now, 1956 saw a lot of upgrades and options making it to the Corvette platform, and the following year saw some important needs to really solidify the Corvette as a legitimate sports car. So in 1957, with it, we have two major developments for the Corvette brand. The first is the introduction of fuel injection into the mix for the V8 engine, which is now a 283 cubic inch 4.6 liter V8 producing a listed 290 horsepower. This was a key attribute that GM's marketing team particularly loved because it was the first time you could ever claim 1 horsepower per cubic inch for a mass-produced engine. But the fuel injection was a big thing in the world where carbureted engines were the norm. If you're not as inclined as a car person and not knowing the significance of this from an engineering point, it's absolutely huge. Before, with carburetors, in very simple terms, they used high flow air to mix the fuel that then got sent into the engine cylinders to combust. And then the way how it regulates how much fuel air mix is via a throttle valve, which opens and closes by certain levels that vary the amount of air that comes into the mix. So very analog, which was effective, but in some ways nowhere near as precise as fuel injection methods, where fuel injection, you literally are injecting fuel directly into the cylinder that is exactly controlled and can be adjusted based on various engine parameters like speed, load, and temperature. So your cold starts are a lot more reliable, your engine is more efficient, and most importantly, you can get a bit more power from your engine with this extra level of control in the mix. So it's one of the core elements to high-powered modern engines today, and it's kind of the engineering breakthroughs that I really get excited to talk about as an engineer, because they designed this stuff and introduced it before there was really any computers or anything that we have resembling our modern technology today. I couldn't imagine designing this kind of stuff as an engineer back then. But anyways, I'm getting sidetracked again. So the 1957 Corvette had fuel injection as an option to get that 290 horsepower, which was huge for that year. And it also led to the second most important event happening that year, which was Corvette finally entering the racing scene. So beforehand, the Corvette was a sports car, but it did not have any real racing history, which is like having a nice juicy steak from your favorite restaurant only to take the first bite and find out that it's made out of tofu. Actually, I don't mind eating tofu, but only when I'm expected to eat tofu. So if I'm expecting a steak, I better get a steak. God, I really want a steak now. I really need to stop using food analogies. So anyways, again, here comes our hero Zora with the Corvette and pushes the brand towards racing for the very first time. So for the first time, you actually could order your 1957 Corvette with special ready-to-race performance options, including an engine fresh air attack package, heavy-duty racing suspension, and even some racing-type wheels. Also in 1957, Zora headed the development of a new racing variation of the Corvette to compete in the 24 Hours of Le Mans in France. Originally known as Project XP64, it would eventually be known as the Corvette SS. It was such a crazy design back then, specializing in a tubular space-framed chassis and a tuned version of the new 283 cubic inch V8. But it was kind of short-lived, as the car was riddled with issues right from the get-go, including a rear bushing failure and some heating issues that were all happening during its debut in 1957 in the Sebring race. And then shortly after, the AMA announced a ban on motor racing for member companies like GM. So it led to the cancellation of further developments of the Corvette SS platform, but it helped start the general history of the Corvette and racing. The racing, though, helped raise a huge interest in the Corvette brand, as sale volumes hit a record for that time, with 6,339 units being sold, which was a jump of almost 83%. So after a vital 1957 year for the C1 Corvette, we are now getting into the cool year of the Corvette in 1958 and the era of huge amounts of chrome and quad headlamps. The 1958 Corvette and the 4 years that followed all featured the exposed 4 headlamp treatment and prominent chrome grills. The instrument panel was updated with placing the tachometer directly in front of the driver that read up to 8,000 RPMs, and that was done to accommodate the more powerful engines now instead of the 6,000 RPMs from the years before. And when it came to engines, the Corvette had 4 different types of engine configurations that customers could choose from the standard engine that produced 240 horsepower that was still carbureted, to the highest powered version, which was fuel injected and outputted 290 horsepower. And as a first time, the Corvette had factory installed seat belts instead of the dealer installed in previous model years. So why is that a big deal? It's a big deal because when something is installed from factory, you tend to have more robust install processes, and it's more consistent among all the vehicles produced. You have engineers that have made the specific tooling to help builders not only make it right, but make it consistently right, over and over and over again. When you have dealers installed by a tech in your service center, you add a lot of extra variables like tools that they're using, the skill and experiences of those techs involved, and then simple things like the instructions laid out via a paper that could be misinterpreted, leading to improper installs. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a time and place for dealer type installs, like when you're upgrading the front splitter on your C8 Corvette. It's pretty straightforward, but when it comes to a significant safety feature like the seatbelt, I think it's a huge advancement from an engineering point and production point, where GM is honestly looking at things like quality and safety of their products. So something I think is actually pretty good from an engineering point. Okay, going into 1959, the next year, we're almost touching the 60s. We have some small changes to the interior with different instrument panel graphics, but essentially it was actually probably the quietest year for the Corvette in regards to changes. GM added a positive reverse lockout shifter with a T-handle as a standard option with a 4-speed manual transmission, which honestly looked pretty cool. But finally getting into the 1960s, we see some exterior changes, including the taillights molded into the rear fenders and fewer but heavier looking teeth in that chrome grille. But probably the biggest new feature coming was the aluminum radiators, and also for the first time, all fuel injection engines required the manual transmission. 1960 probably had also one of the rarest colors ever seen, which was a metallic cascade green, which only saw 140 of them ever made with that color. But now moving into the last couple of years of the Generation 1 C1 Corvette, we're in 1961, 1962, and GM did not pull their punches with the upgrades. We had some exterior upgrades, again, also with really significant upgrades to the engine. So exterior wise, we see the twin tail lights appear on the 1961 Corvette for the first time, an iconic visual treatment that honestly has been kept tradition to this day even with the C1 Corvette. But you also saw the debut of the boat tail rear end, which was something that carried onto the second generation Corvette, or the C2 Corvette. So even before the C2 Corvette came into fruition, GM was already hinting at what that was soon to kind of look like. like. And at least in 1961, while the engine displacement stayed the same, GM was still able to increase their power of their fuel-injected engine from 275 to actually 315 horsepower. So we're healthily above 300 horsepower mark, which was pretty freaking huge. But it wasn't anywhere near as huge as compared to the following year in 1962. No, as the last year hurrah for the C1 Corvette, GM came out with a new, larger engine for the 1962 Corvette model. Instead of the 283 cubic inch engine producing 315 horsepower at most, the new engine with hydraulic fuel lifters and fuel injection produced 360 horsepower. So we're now closer to 400 horsepower as a mark rather than the 300 horsepower in 1962, a car that was made over 60 years ago. That absolutely amazes me. And yeah, also the 1962 C1 Corvette saw the last solid rear axle suspension that was used all the way from the beginning of the C1 Corvette, and it's part of also why it's considered the solid axle generation. And something that, while it was a standard for the C1, will then go away the following year when the C2 generation came to be with its independent rear suspension. But continuing the history of the Corvette, the C2 Corvette is a whole other story that I'm going to be excited to share in the next video of this History of Speed series. Which, for real guys, the C2 Corvette has some amazing historical points, including probably the most iconic year of the brand of Corvettes, the 1963 Corvette with its rear split window design. So if you've enjoyed listening to the history so far and haven't subscribed to the channel already, I definitely invite you to join, subscribe to the channel, as well as like this video. It does help both grow this channel and help support me making more of these kind of videos. So I appreciate the support. It really means a lot to me. Okay, so there's still one more piece of Gen 1 Corvette history that we still need to talk about. I mentioned that the C1 Corvette made a huge contribution to the existence of the Shelby Cobra, which was the brainchild of the one and only Carroll Shelby, which is totally true, but how in the world does a Corvette have anything to do with a Shelby Cobra? Well, to answer that, we actually need to go back to 1955. A Texan oil well drilling contractor named Gary Laughlin wondered, would it be possible to make a car with Italian design characteristics, but using the chassis and engine components from a good old American car like the Corvette? And to make that idea come to life, he enlisted the help of a car constructor named Jim Hall and race car driver Carroll Shelby, who he was really good friends with. I kind of find it funny and trying to imagine that conversation back then. Like, could you even imagine like Gary in a bar talking to Carroll Shelby like, Carroll, come here. Come here. I don't even know if they were in a bar. They probably, like, it probably didn't happen in a bar. But I like imagining this, and it's my video, so we're gonna just have fun with it. Listen to me. I know them Italians make some really nice sports cars, but I like the good old American muscle that's going on here. So stay with me here. What if we combined a Ferrari with a Corvette? I think that would make one hell of a sports car. And then Carroll Shelby must have been looking at him and like, you know what? Damn it, you're right, I'm in. And then they got Jim Hall as a car constructor into the mix at some other bar, and he was like, damn it, I'm in too. Again, probably they didn't talk at a bar, maybe a diner, I don't freaking know. Maybe it was like a diner, how you saw in Ford versus Ferrari with Carroll Shelby and Ken Miles, when Carroll was pitching the idea of Ford making a race car that could go against old man Ferrari at the 24-hour Le Mans. But I just wanted to have fun with this video when I was making it. So in any case though, the three of them agreed to go and do this job. And then after the job was done, each of them would receive a custom Corvette made to their liking. So the trio managed to get 3 rolling Corvette chassis off the production line and then arranged to have them shipped to Modena, Italy. Over there, with the help of Road and Track correspondent Pete Coltrane, they actually managed to get in touch with an Italian coach builder, Sergio Scaglietti. I can't talk. He was famous for his design work on Ferrari road cars back in the day. Scaglietti agreed to create and fit a new lightweight aluminum body to each of these cars in secret. And it had to be in secret because Enzo Ferrari happened to have heard of the development and reportedly threatened to cancel Scaglietti's partnership with Ferrari over it. But thankfully it still happened, and the resulting Corvettes ended up weighing roughly 400 pounds less than any other Corvette at that time. All custom made, where car number 1, finished in red and originally for Laughlin, was slightly different than the other 2 cars because it accommodated an existing Corvette front grille. It originally came with a 283 cubic inch V8 and a 4-barrel carburetor, which was mated to a 2-speed automatic transmission. Car number 2, originally for Hall, was finished in a blue, and it had a closer resemblance to the Ferrari 250 GT Berlinetta, I can't say these names, and came with the same carbureted V8 and transmission as car number 1. Now, car number 3 was intended for Carroll Shelby, which was also finished in a red and looked similar to car number 2, but was more unique as it was fitted with a fuel injection and Borg-Warnen 4-speed manual transmission. No surprise, it's Carroll Shelby's car. Shelby's car was really special, not only because it was more powerful and sporty, but Carroll was hoping to entice the likes of GM, showing what a lighter and more powerful Corvette version could look like with some European influence. He hoped that it would be enough to convince GM to adopt the idea, but unfortunately they weren't interested. And unfortunately, the Scaglietti Corvettes were plagued with issues from it taking 2 years to produce them from concept to delivery, and then things like the aluminum bodies had a dramatic impact to the weight ratio and how it worked with the chassis, resulting in the front lift actually dangerously lifting when you were at high speed. It's a shame because, as you know, Carroll took his overall idea of a European American sports car to Ford, who were open to the idea of working with him, and then he produced the Shelby Cobra. Hindsight is 2020, but I freaking wondered if a partnership with Carroll Shelby and GM, how that would have looked like in a crazy Corvette version, if it would have ever come to fruition, how that would have just been. Regardless, the C1 Corvette had made its mark on history, birthing an American icon that is known and loved today through all the generations of Corvette, including the latest C8 Corvette that I absolutely adore. Guys, this was a fun video to make, and I honestly don't know how long this video is, but I'm pretty sure it's the longest video I've ever done so far. And I guess I'll have to see once I actually put it all together. But if you watched the whole thing, I appreciate you joining me on this ride through history, this history of speed. And I'm really looking forward to the next video where we continue this history of the Corvette and the Generation 2, the C2 Corvette Stingray. So when that video is out, you'll see it right here to check out. It'll be part of our special monthly videos that I plan to put out at the beginning of every month. So if you're not subscribed, but you want to know when this video comes out, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. But in the meantime, check out any of my other videos, and we'll see you next time. Take care, guys.